CUs as soon as they come out. My personal recommendation with service packs would be you better wait for at least a quarter before you apply a service pack. In the meanwhile, you get the rest of the world do the beta for you and come back and let you know if applying a service pack makes or breaks your environment. Um, unless you have an immediate issue that this service pack is definitely going to resolve with you, or if you have a Microsoft person on the phone with you. But other than that, I definitely recommend that you hold off at least a few weeks or a few months before you apply a new service pack that comes out for SharePoint. I'm sure also, on large companies, every company has strict policies on how to make servers more secure with, local admin privileges or any other form of securities that you have on the server. You should definitely, make sure that you are complying within your own organization, right? The last thing that I would like to also recognize is if you are, I'm pretty sure a lot of people do this also is, but make sure that, if you want SharePoint to be a success, don't put too much else on that same box, or actually nothing else on that box. If you have a SharePoint box, use it only for SharePoint purposes. Do not use it for hosting a .NET application or hosting something else that leverages Tomcat on that same box. Um, you know, Once again, depending on organization, you can make the best judgment over there, but that would still be the right recommendation. And so next thing that we come up to now is the services on the server, right? As we know, with SharePoint 2007, we had about 4 or 5 different services that had to be run on the server. The central admin service, the Excel services, search service, incoming email. If you had project server would be another service, and the SharePoint web application service. With 2010, we now have at least 15 different services that need to be run. What needs to be identified here is if you're building a single server environment, there's no biggie. Everything runs on the same server. But if you are running anything from a medium server to a large server environment, you need to really understand what services can be load balanced and how they can scale properly. For example, the document conversion services or Excel calculation services, or the BCS services, um, search service. They can all be load balanced. They can all be scaled. So make sure that at least in a large environment you have at least more than one server that's running the service in case of failovers, right? These are all load balance service. The only thing that's not load balanced in this environment is the user profile synchronization service. Um, we had done a presentation about this. I think I done one a couple of months ago. If you need some more details, but one user profile sync service can only be associated with one service application, so you cannot truly load balance it. It's a little complicated to understand. If you need more details on that, feel free to reach out to me and I'll get you some more details on that. But other than that, just be careful and document, you know, each and every service that's running properly. In cases if you are implementing Kerberos, you'll definitely also want to understand how services are running on different servers because you'll have to set up the SPNs accordingly, especially for the Excel services, the business connectivity services. SQL Server. Depending on your environment, you will either use a single SQL server or a SQL cluster. For large farms, obviously everybody will go to SQL cluster. Um, it's very important to understand that once again, SQL is going to be your biggest bottleneck for SharePoint, right? Everything goes back and forth with SQL constantly. So it's highly recommended that you use a dedicated SQL cluster for SharePoint and not have it shared for any other purposes, especially for productions. For QA and development, it might be okay to have them hosted on single servers or share cluster somewhere else. And make sure there's enough disk space on SQL. If you haven't done your planning for backup and recovery, you should always, factor that in and give enough disk space, especially on the C drive. I'm pretty sure you're going to have separate drives for data and logs, but the C drive should also have always enough separate, you know, enough disk space available so SQL can perform properly. Our recommendation minimum for SharePoint databases have 3 separate data drives available in addition to the C drive. Have a separate drive for data, separate for transaction logs, and another drive for backups. And I'll get into more details about how to allocate sizing for this later on in the presentation. The short answer for SQL is, if you assume you're going to have 100 gigs of data in your environment, make sure you always allocate 1.5 times additional disk free space on SQL. So if you're going to have 100 gigs of content, including all the necessary SharePoint databases, right? Make sure you allocate at least 250 gigs of disk space for that SQL data drive. And we'll get back to that later on if possible during the backup and recovery section of why that's necessary. So web applications, for every organization, whether it's small or medium or large, I see at least three different minimum web applications that are necessary that needs to be created. One for collaboration, one for my site, and potentially if you're going to be writing applications, then you want to create a separate application for a web application for custom development stuff, right? The reason I like to keep custom applications in a separate web applications is then you're not messing around with web application. When you're messing around with the web.config for that one, you're not affecting the day-to-day collaborations. So if you're deploying Ajax, or if you're deploying a custom feature, or if you're making changes to the web.config for connectivity information to your data sources, you're basically working in a web.config that's been dedicated for applications. It does not affect your day-to-day collaboration in any manner. You know, that's one of the biggest reasons I like to keep applications in a separate web application by itself. In the past, I've also seen people say, I need to have a custom URL for my site, so I need to have finance.mycompany.com or hr.mycompany.com, and a lot of people don't realize that host header or vanity sites can be created just as site collections in existing web applications, and they would just go ahead and start creating more content databases, I'm sorry, more web applications. It is not a good idea to create a separate web application just for hosting one site by itself, unless this is going to be truly a large portal site internally with lots of hits, thousands of hits, hundreds of pages on it, that actually justifies that it needs to be available, 24/7, no issues kind of thing. But other than that, you're better off creating hosted or site collections in existing web applications. It's going to be easier for you to manage. It's going to take less resources away from your servers. The more web applications you create, the more processes you're running, the more resources you're taking away from your server at that point. Site collections and content database. This has been my favorite topic since the last 4 to 5 years. Is trying to understand how people organize their site collections, right? And I did a huge presentation on this about 4 years ago, even with 2007 version. The the idea with site collections is to make sure that you plan as much as possible on what your farm is going to be upfront, right? And then start defining quotas so you can actually identify how much SQL disk space you're going to need for it. For example, you might want to start off with starter quotas of 1 gig or 2 gigs, and then grow from there to 2 gigs, 5 gigs, 10 gigs, 15 gigs, 20 gigs. In the current day situation, generating documents is very easy. Every company, whether it's small or large, has hundreds of thousands of documents very easily. So I recommend to start off anywhere from 1 gigs to 2 gigs in a start site quota to begin with, and then see how people grow from there on a team basis. Right. The other way to do site collections is create content databases for grouping similar sites. Uh, I try to do them by high priority sites, by large sites, by custom applications, or by collaboration sites. And this just helps me easily identify when somebody calls me and says something's wrong with my site collection and I need to restore it from Lightnight Backup. I don't have to go about looking to figure out which content database it belonged to. I know that it was of type so and so, so it has to be from one of these two content databases. In a situation where you're building 10,000, 15,000 site collections in large enterprises, and you can potentially have, anywhere from 500 gigs to 5 terabytes of data, it's going to be very important for you to figure out which database had that information, and if I need to go back for backup and bring the data from 2 weeks ago, what backup am I looking for, right? So the better you organize them up front, the better it's going to be for you later on when you have to do backups and restores, or try to find information about where was the site collection 2 weeks ago, in which content database was it. From a sizing perspective, my recommendation would be to keep a single site collection at a maximum of 20 gigs in a collaboration space. There are limitations with STS, ADM, or the PowerShell stuff on trying to back up and restore sites that are more than 20 gigs in size. I don't think Microsoft even says. I think even Microsoft would be say okay with that part. But I think more than that, I'd be very careful about making site collections that grow beyond that. Um, I do have, if you see above, I also have a grouping for large sites. In larger organizations, especially when people want to do document management or records management, there will be sites that will be growing beyond 20 gigs. But you need to take them on a case-by-case basis and make sure they are active documents only and not something that people are just dumping in there. SharePoint, as everybody keeps emphasizing, is a collaboration platform. It's not a dumping ground or a records management tool. I mean, even though we have the record center, on a day-to-day basis, you really don't want to have sites that have 50 gigs or 100 gigs of data right within that site collection. So, at 20 gigs per site, at a maximum, you don't want to grow beyond more than 200 to 250 gigs per content database. If you speak to your DBAs, they'll tell you that depending on your size and stuff, backing up a 250 gig database could take significant amount of time and disk space every day. I know when I used to work with another company before, they said that backing up a database that was like 500 megs or 500 gigs or a terabyte of data could pretty much take anywhere from 6 hours to 12 hours just to back up, and restore would be equally the same. So work with your DBAs to figure out, if I have a 250 gig database, how long does it take for me to do a backup? How long would it take me for me to do a recovery, right? Because it's not just the size of the database; it's going to be the size of your disk speed and amount of disk space that's going to be available for you. Um, for example, let's say you have SQL cluster and you allocate at least 4 drives to the SQL cluster to begin with, and you start off with 4 partitions of 500 gigs or 512 gigs each. If you have, if you
Thank you for listening to a highlighted segment of SharePoint Shop Talk. Join us live and ask your own questions every Thursday, 12:30 to 1:30 p.m. You may also join our group on LinkedIn at SharePoint Shop Talk. That's our group name. And we hope that you can join us. We look forward to the continued sharing of SharePoint knowledge.